I've literally been waiting 15 years to make this video. 15 years ago, I sat in a school meeting and was accused of educational neglect because of my son's reading scores. Educational neglect, that's a legal term for child abuse. I'm a certified learning specialist, and I've spent my entire career, now nearly 3 decades, studying how the brain learns specifically to support students. My husband and I are both educators, and this was happening in the district where he was employed. I'll tell you more about what happened and what it taught me in just a moment. Meanwhile, if you're navigating reading struggles at any level, maybe you have a struggling 3rd grader, maybe you're getting reports that your middle or high schooler is below level, and you're left holding the weight of it all, trying to make sense of confusing scores, mixed messages, and that constant fear that you're somehow missing something important, then this video is for you. Especially if part of you is trying to stay calm and be a good parent, while another part of you is quietly panicking. Over the years, I have worked with students from early elementary through college, and I can tell you this with complete confidence. When we understand how the reading brain actually works, progress can accelerate at any age. That's not just motivational fluff. That's based on the actual mechanics of how the brain processes written language and information. I call it the neuro-reading circuit. Meanwhile, just this year, my youngest graduated from high school, which is now giving me a lot more bandwidth to help other families. So I'm now making this video and establishing this channel for my younger self, the devastated mom who drove home from that meeting in tears 15 years ago. If that's you right now, I am sincerely sorry for your worry and stress. But I do want to assure you that you're not doing anything wrong. Your child is not broken. There is reason for hope. And the path forward is often much clearer, lighter, and more doable than families have been led to believe. So you've come to the right place. Grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's talk about what's really going on. What happened? Just weeks after my son started 1st grade, his entire personality, his spirit even shifted. He became very withdrawn, flat. He said things about how he was feeling that no 6-year-old should ever have to think, let alone experience, and we were terrified. We began a long journey with doctors and specialists trying to understand what was happening. Meanwhile, school continued. 7 months into his 1st grade year, we received a letter from the principal requesting a meeting about his reading scores. Now, I had been reading with him almost every night and wasn't terribly concerned, but when the letter arrived, I assumed maybe I had been preoccupied with his other issues and too overwhelmed to notice a problem. So before the meeting, I did some of my own reading assessments with him to get a more objective view of what was happening. When I walked into that meeting with the principal, I was expecting collaboration, like 2-sided conversation about what each of us was observing. Instead, I learned something I hadn't known. They had been pulling our son from art, from music, gym, recess, all for extra reading remediation. And our son hadn't told us because he thought he was in trouble. At that moment, so much of what we had been seeing at home just started to make sense. He was spending his days under intense pressure, confused and ashamed, quietly believing that he was always disappointing the adults around him. And for someone who was wired to please others, that must have been especially devastating for him. On top of that, despite all of the extra intervention they had him doing, they handed me a report with 6 graphs on it, each measuring a different element of literacy. Every single one flatlined. No growth, according to them. Their conclusion? He couldn't read. And if it didn't improve, I could face charges of educational neglect. I couldn't make this up. It would make for nonsense fiction if I did. But needless to say, that was our son's last day at that school because we could not risk being put in a position where we would have to fight to keep our own child. Now, let me be clear. This was an extreme situation. The language in that meeting and the threats attached to it were unusually severe. But the deeper pattern? Sadly, that part is not as rare. I have since heard hundreds of family stories with similar themes. And very often, families are pressured, blamed, or made to feel at fault when their child or teen's reading profile is being misunderstood. Now, I want to be clear, this is not about villainizing educators or schools, because I understand most educators are like my husband and myself. We care very deeply. But care is not the same thing as clarity, and there are major gaps in the system. When we don't understand how reading actually works, we can misinterpret what we're seeing. And misinterpretation can cause real harm. One question changed everything. As I said earlier, I drove home from that meeting in tears, and they didn't stop all night. For one, it was just months of stress that were coming to the surface, but it was also the sting of such a brute attack on my integrity and worse, on my child, especially from someone I expected to be in our corner. Yet there was something else, and that was a very strange clarity. It was a paradox because I was so deeply hurt, and yet I had such clarity that this was happening for a good reason. Later that night, well after we put the kids to bed, the tears were still falling, and my husband tried to encourage me. He said, there's a reason for this. You'll see. We'll turn it around to help others. And I replied, through the tears, in my head, I know that so vividly. I told him, I said, but right now my heart is broken. I said, give me 24 hours to cry, 48 hours to rest, and then I'll be ready to kick some. And that is exactly what happened. I put some boundaries on my grief, got some rest, and got back to work. Ultimately, the difference between the school's reports and my assessments came down to mindset. They held a fixed conclusion. Your child is failing. But I asked a curious question. What is his brain actually doing? And that changed everything. Redefining reading. Before I go further, we need a shared definition for reading because this is where so much confusion begins. I define it as the ability to make accurate meaning from text. And I have yet to meet anyone who disagrees with that definition. However, many reading assessments do not directly measure meaning making. Instead, they often measure sub-skills that are easier to see and score, but that are not the same as measuring comprehension. They measure what's visible on the surface, which is often a reader's accuracy while reading out loud. We call it their fluency or fluency rate. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't ever want to be judged on my ability to read something out loud cold with no prior exposure. Everyone knows that even strong adult readers make more errors reading aloud than they do reading silently. And so when I assessed my son, yes, many of the surface level measures were lower than ideal. But when I checked whether he was actually making meaning from text, he was solidly at grade level. And most importantly, his errors were not random. They were clues. Errors are signals. When we read, our brain uses 3 primary channels of information. The symbol channel decodes the letter symbols. It asks what looks right, while the grammar channel asks what sounds right, all while the context channel pulls everything together by asking what makes sense. Strong readers use all 3 flexibly, and all 3 channels cross-check constantly. But most school-based assessments heavily emphasize what's easiest to see and score, especially students' fluency, which is reading out loud, rather than directly measuring whether meaning is being constructed. If fluency drops below a certain rate, the assumption is that the text is too difficult, drop down a level. That's efficient, but it's not nuanced, and reading is a nuanced process. Here's the paradox. The very thing that we label as errors are actually evidence of high-level processing in the brain. So for example, if a student substitutes a word that makes sense, but is not the exact printed word, that tells us something powerful. It tells us that their brain is making meaning. So that's not carelessness, that's active comprehension. And that is exactly how scores can stay flat on paper while real reading comprehension is present underneath. The graph looks alarming, but the graph is not measuring the full reading process. And if we miss how the brain is working, then we choose the wrong intervention. That's what happened in my meeting with the principal. He was holding flat graphs. I was holding a treasure trove of clues. Rapid reading recovery. I mentioned that prior to that meeting, there were so many things that were off. We had not yet pinpointed the what or why until the meeting, but we had already chosen a different school for 2nd grade. So thankfully, that new school was both, 1, willing to welcome him for the last quarter of 1st grade, and 2, shared my observations about his reading. So we were able to quickly align on a plan. And first and foremost, we agreed to focus on building his confidence through his strengths. On that note, they promised me that he would never miss his specials again. Just removing him from the original school environment reduced his emotional intensity significantly, but it took another year to recover from the damage. So during that time, we just focused on stability, not so much on pushing reading. But then when we felt he was ready, I implemented a simple summer intervention plan. It was about 3 hours a week. That was it. Very targeted and sequenced, aligned with how the brain actually processes text. We didn't chase symptoms, we supported the actual reading system. That intervention framework that I used with him is the foundation of all of my work with students and what I now teach families on this channel. And by the end of that summer, he had made up what had become 2 lost years and was reading on grade level by every measure. That growth was possible because the instruction matched how his brain processed text. And I have since seen this over and over again with elementary, middle, high school, even college students. When we align instruction with how the brain actually learns, progress accelerates at any age. The reading paradox. On this channel, we protect the reading and thinking brain because reading is the gateway skill, but learning is the long game. Reading builds attention, it builds working memory, it builds self-monitoring, confidence, and of course, it's a vital access point for information. When reading is misinterpreted, everything downstream is affected. And this is the paradox. What looks like reading isn't always meaning-making. And most assessments, they measure what's visible, not always what's actually happening beneath the surface. So today we made the invisible visible, because once you can see what's really happening inside the reading brain, everything changes. In my next video, I walk you through the 3 signals that I mentioned earlier, the ones that every reading brain uses inside the neuro-reading circuit, and how to recognize them in your own child or teen. Once you see them, you won't be able to unsee them. And if you're feeling overwhelmed or unsure of where to start, I have a free masterclass linked below. In this video, we focused on one painful but common misunderstanding, the difference between surface-level reading performance and actual meaning-making. In the masterclass, I take you further into the full system of learning, how reading, motivation, emotional load, and executive function all interact, and what to do when that system breaks down. I'll walk you through simple models that bring clarity to what's really going on and where to start. Because you are not crazy, you are not negligent, and your child or teen is certainly not broken. We just have to make the invisible visible.